It is time to start. I'm Elizabeth Gregory. I'm the director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program here at the University of Houston. And I'm happy to welcome you to today's panel in the Barbara Cargaby Living Archive series sponsored by the Friends of Women's Studies. The Living Archive series aims to present a sense of the complex history of women's lives in Houston and of the struggles and changes that have characterized that history, and it's been going on since 1996, so this is our 20th year. I'd like to recognize our Friends board members past and present who are here today for their good work. I just generally applaud them. And I wanted to note that the Living Archives panels are videotaped and become part of the archive, which is based here in the library, so you can go back and see past episodes at will. The Friends also sponsor the Table Talk Lunch, which is upcoming on March 24th, and there's still time to buy a table or a ticket. I also invite students to look into courses in women's gender and sexuality studies, either the intro courses or the minor or the major, which provide the analytic tools for understanding our contemporary society and your place in it. Because as you may have already noticed, life is a gender studies course, and you might as well come prepared. Today's panel explores the ongoing problem of sexual assault with a focus on the special dynamic of campus assault, since campus is where we are. Sad to say, sexual assault has long been the practice in many cultures and subcultures, a means by which not only are people forced into sexual situations that they don't want at that particular moment, but it's also a means by which women as a group are intimidated or threatened and made to feel that their voices don't matter in ways that affect their whole lives and society's whole view toward women, which of course is changing. Sexual assault includes assault of vulnerable children by family members, friends, or strangers. It includes campus assaults where young people are living away from home and where there's often a heavy drinking culture. In the nation, we have rapes, intimidation, sometimes combined with violence by strangers, dates, spouses, and others. And around the world, it's used as a means of controlling women in the sort of don't go out or you'll be attacked. It's also used as a war strategy to force the enemy to bear the children of their attackers and live with them forever. Pretty horrible. And you hear about this on the radio all the time, and we just sort of, it becomes background. We just assume that that's the way of the world. So obviously we can't talk about all of this today, but they are all related, and the set indicates the depth of the problem. The good news is that we do question it, and there are laws that make it illegal and policies that can make it less likely. Part of the question is, feminists have been highlighting the problem for decades, so why is it so hard to fix? And what are the steps that have proved efficacious? We'll focus on campus dynamics for today, including the role played nationally by sports culture and drinking in rape and sexual assault, an issue that was documented in a national report about sports fans just this week, and an issue of special importance here at U of H, both because we are raising our sports profile and because we have increasing numbers of students living in dorms on campus. So our whole situation has changed. So football brings a lot of fun and excitement to campus, and it's great to watch really stellar athletes do great things. But we want to be sure that changing and growing our campus culture is not done at the expense of our female students. So we're very happy to have Coach Herman here with us today to participate in this dialogue, and we're happy to have here as well Jessica Luther, who has reported on and thought deeply about these dynamics nationally, and also to have Dr. Richard Baker and Dr. Laura McGuire. Dr. Baker is a longtime pro-activist on these issues on campus, and Dr. McGuire is a new voice. Nothing like dialogue to move us toward solutions. Our moderator today is the superb Dr. Beverly McPhail. She is a feminist social worker, academic, writer, wife, and mother, and she used to be the director of the Women's Resource Center here at U of H for 8 years, where she fomented a lot of the positive change that we now reap the benefit of. She currently is an independent scholar and teaches women's issues as an adjunct faculty member at the Graduate College of Social Work, as well as in the WGSS program right here. We will have time for questions at the end, and then sandwiches, and Beverly will introduce our panels. Please join me in welcoming.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay. Well, it's really wonderful to be here today, and I think even the weather is approving. We went from rain to this lovely sunshine, and this is a wonderful room actually to be in, rain or shine. So I'm so glad you all could join us, and I'm really delighted about our panelists. I think the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program did a wonderful job of assembling this panel, and I think we're going to learn a lot from them. So as Elizabeth noted, we're going to, I'm going to get to ask the questions from 11:30 to 12:30. And actually, Dr. McGuire, to my immediate left, said, you know, last time she was at one of these things, the audience did not have enough time to ask questions. So I might even end up shorter asking questions to allow you all to ask more questions. I thought that was a great idea. So, and then after that, we do get wonderful sandwiches. I would highly recommend the chicken salad. Okay, sandwiches. They're very lovely. Of course, sexual assault on college campuses is a really big topic right now, and that's very exciting, I think, to a lot of us who have been working in this field for quite a long time. The women's movement started looking at sexual assault in the 1970s, you know, where we really said this is unacceptable, it's a crime, it can no longer just be to see, you know, a woman's lot in life, that this is something that could happen to her. And we started working with law enforcement and developing rape crisis centers. There was this whole movement, and it was really wonderfully and exciting. But on the same time, you wonder, why are we rediscovering it now on college campuses? And we've made some progress, but in some ways we've made very little progress. But thanks to some really high-profile cases, I mean, I guess that's a good news and bad news. There's been some really high-profile cases on college campuses that have really directed a lot of attention to the issue. There's been some wonderful student activism. You know, sometimes some of us gray-haired, cranky old feminists say, where is the activism of these young women? But there is some, this is an academic term, kick-ass young feminists, you know, out there who are doing wonderful work on this issue and really raising the profile and demanding a lot from their universities. And then, thank goodness, there's some new federal regulations. Now, I hope I'm talking to a friendly crowd. I know some people are very against the government imposing new regulations, but, you know, when the government says to college campuses, you know, you have to investigate these cases, you have to do so in a timely manner, or you could lose your federal funding. People who weren't so interested before get very interested. So I am really glad for the federal government's attention. At U of H, you know, it's kind of hard to say what the campus climate is here, and I'm going to leave it to some people on the panel to answer that. The only hard quantifiable data we have is from the annual campus security reports. And they said in 2012, that report reported that there were 2 reported forcible sexual offenses. In 2013, there were 10. And 2014, there were 13. So the number is going up. Is that good news? Is that bad news? Some people think, oh, the rates are going up. A lot of us think, well, they've always been that high, but now people are just more comfortable coming forward. However, we also know that rape in general on college campuses and across the nation is one of the most underreported crimes, so we really don't know where those numbers are. So without further ado, those are some of the questions we're going to look at to ask our experts to talk about. And let me just briefly introduce them. They have a much longer biography that you can read about, and it's certainly worth taking a look at because their awards and their experience is wonderful. I'm just going to pick out a few things. To my left is Dr. Laura McGuire, and she is a new addition to U of H and a very exciting one. She was hired with the UH Wellness Team in December of 2015 as a Sexual Violence Prevention and Education Program Manager, which is a long title, and I can't wait to hear more about what she's doing. She just got her doctorate, and her dissertation was, again a long title, Seen But Not Heard, Pathways to Improve Inclusion of LGBT Persons and Sexual Trauma Survivors in Sexual Health Education. And so she does a lot of teaching and training on issues concerning sexual health, trauma-informed pedagogy, cultural competency, queer competency, and feminist theory, to name a few. Okay, so we're delighted to have you here, Dr. McGuire. And then Coach Tom Herman, we're delighted to have you join us, and he's also relatively new. He's been here a year, but what a year. I don't know if we have football fans, but he gave us quite an exciting season, 13-1. It ended with a win at the Peach Bowl, the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl on New Year's Eve over FSU. And if I can just say a little aside, I graduated from the University of Florida, so I'm a Gator, so any day we beat FSU is a good day in my book. But I was looking for something maybe a little more than we could talk about, because his list of honors and the coaching thing, it was very impressive, but it kind of sounded like Greek to me. So I was looking for something different, and I don't know if people know this, but I thought this was very interesting. He is a member of Mensa, which I had to remember, what that was, but that is people who score on the top 2% of general population, and the top 2% of the general population on accepted standardized intelligence tests, which means he's a really smart guy, as well as being a football coach. A couple things that I was very interested in reading about him is his looking at the team, which hopefully he can say how he looks through this lens when it comes to sexual assault, that he's very interested in motivating his players. He sees them as part of a family, and he likes to hold them publicly accountable, within their public of their team. So I'm interested in how he applies that to sexual assault. So welcome, really glad to have you here. And then also next is Miss Jessica Luther. And I don't know if people follow her, but we're delighted to have her on campus because she's a national treasure. She really digs into the intersection of sports and rape culture. She also looks at sports from the angle of homophobia, sexism, racism. She really does some wonderful writing, so be sure to go out there and look at many of her pieces. And she has a new book coming out, which sounds very exciting, coming out in the fall. Maybe we could have her back for a book signing. Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape. So very heavy and deep. One thing I read about her in an interview that I thought was very interesting, she was identified as a feminist sports fan. And for some people that might be an oxymoron, but I think it fits, and we're really delighted to have you here. And then going down to the last but certainly not least is Dr. Richard Baker, who I'm really proud and pleased to have worked with here at University of Houston. And I have to read his title because it's impressive and it's long. He is currently the Assistant Vice Chancellor and Vice President for Equal Opportunity Services for the University of Houston. And so he's responsible for managing the university's anti-discrimination efforts, and he conducts some of those formal investigation to complaints. He does some prevention training. He was the one who founded and started Cougs Consent for Cougs, Cougs for Consent? Cougs Get Consent. When I worked here, he was a wonderful ally. He's really committed to this work, a sense of fairness for both the perpetrator, the accused or alleged perpetrator, and the victim. He's known nationally as a speaker and trainer, so, and he has many degrees, which I can't go into, but he's a doctor, a JD. I mean, he's very impressive. So this is our panel. I'm really excited to have them here. So let's jump in with the first question. I'm going to start with Jessica because she's been looking at this across the board and writing a lot about it. And one of the intersections she looks at is between campus culture and rape culture and sports culture. So can you tell us, what are you finding, and what are some of the experiences you've had?
Sure. Everyone can hear me, right? Well, I want to say, so I'm a journalist, and I want to say off the bat that most of the time people come to me because they have a problem, right? And so most of the time I'm interacting with people, it's because they are sad that something has happened to them. And so a lot of what I see, it's very rare someone is like, hey, this campus was really great to me. So a lot of what, I obviously wrote a book on college football and sexual assault, and I can't believe that I get to sit next to Tom Herman right now. This is really comfortable. I think one of the things to say about this is that we can really analyze sports culture in a very particular way. We can talk about locker room culture. We can talk about how many men there are and what it means when there are a lot of men together in a particular space, and how that reflects on sexism, ideas about women, about consent, all these sorts of things. But, one of the reasons I write on that is because it's a lens into larger problems everywhere, right? And that's the same thing with campus. So I can look at campus athletes, student athletes, but that's just a reflection on the campus, which is just a reflection on our overall culture and how we look at this stuff. I think a lot of what's going on is we're having a new conversation, right? We're seeing a lot more survivors coming forward. We're hearing a lot more stories about how they feel silenced, they feel shamed. And each time a survivor comes forward, then another survivor comes forward, and we're sort of in a moment of avalanche. We see this every once in a while, like 20 years ago, anytime I look back in archives, there was like a moment in the early 90s where this was happening too. So I hope that we'll see change, that we won't 20 years from now be doing the same panel, saying the same things. I think one of the big things that we see a lot is that when people come forward, they are in a crisis. I think people forget that it's a total crisis. When I interview and I talk with survivors and I talk with their families, these are people who don't know what to do. A lot of them have experienced like real trauma. They're operating in a body that has experienced trauma. Their brains are affected by trauma, and they are looking for resources. They often don't know where to go. Even in a campus situation, campuses are working very hard to try to fix this. I think Dr. Baker is going to talk a lot about this, but who do you go to? Who is the Title IX coordinator? What does that person do? Do I go to the campus police? Do I go to the city police? Why should I do that? What does it mean to report? I was just interviewing a survivor yesterday who was telling me that even after talking to their Title IX coordinator on their campus, they didn't even understand what reporting meant, leaving the office. And I think sometimes that's literally because they're traumatized. And trying to put all the pieces together can be really difficult in these sort of crisis moments. And so it can, from the outside, we can be looking at like what football teams are doing to teach their players, or we can be looking at what Title IX coordinators are doing on campus. But it's really important, I think, to remember that these are survivors, and their world can be so chaotic, and we are trying so hard to put a framework on that makes sense to us from the outside. And it can just be so difficult to, I'm just gonna back up. And I just wanna, So the point is that people are so confused, they're in crisis, and putting these frameworks in place have to always operate in the fact that that's how it is.
Well, thanks. I think you spoke eloquently. I mean, I can't imagine a young person, often it's women, but men, coming to get a college education, and then it's hijacked by this traumatic event, that happens. We do tend to focus sometimes on athletes and fraternity members as primary perpetrators, even though we do know it happens other people and off college campuses. But Coach Herman, what do you do to address this? It sounds like from what I've read that you're really interested in having a positive team culture. So do you address this with your athletes, and if so, how?
We quite regularly address it, and through Dr. Baker's office, we educate them. We also bring in speakers from outside to educate them, and I think obviously that's a big word for us, educate, because people learn in different ways, and every member of our team learns in a different way. So the bombardment of education is necessary to make sure that you're reaching all of them, and because one thing will click for one young man, but it may not click for another, but the other thing clicks, and so on and so forth. And I know for me, and the thing that I do personally with our guys, the education hit home when you put a face on it. And I've got a daughter, I've got a wife, I've got a mother, and I think when you put a face to these women in your education with your student athletes, most of them have sisters, they've got mothers, they've got women that mean something to them in their lives, and they certainly would never want any of this to happen to them. And so when you can personalize it, I think for them, it adds a lot of weight and gravity to the issue for them. When it's a generality and you start spitting out statistics, this, that, and the other, I think sometimes that flies over their head. But when you can truly personalize it and put a face to the trauma, and that face being a loved one of theirs, I think that, at least for myself, has been the best way to hit home in all of the educational efforts that we do.
Well, thank you for that great answer. Maybe I'll have one follow-up, because I know one story that Ms. Luther reported on, and it kind of reminded me of some of the Catholic priests, that there would be a problem with a priest, and then they would just move them to another diocese and the same problem would happen. And that seems like that's happened sometimes in the football programs, that a player has been released, but another team is happy to pick them up. How would you handle that if you had a player that maybe had a sexual assault? Would you be willing to let them go to another team? Or if you were getting a player that you knew had a history of violence against women?
Yeah, I think the key there is to gather your facts. That there's no such thing as too much information when it comes to that, and I think accusal is certainly different than guilt, and so you've got to weigh a young man and what were the circumstances, what's the truth, and so to say that just being accused of something like this would automatically disqualify them from being considered as part of our team. That's certainly not the case. But if they were obviously guilty of this, we would not welcome them. Our second core value, we have 5 core values. The first one being honesty. The second one is treat women with respect. And so those are words we live by. And so if something like that were to happen to one of our teammates and they were guilty of that and it was in fact proved guilty, then they would not be welcome in our family. And the same for if they were found guilty at any other university.
Okay. Well, thank you. And boy, that's really wonderful that the second core value is to respect women.
Yeah.
I mean, that's great. Well, speaking of education, that seems to move over to Dr. McGuire. So I guess that's a big part of your role, is to educate. Of course, I feel like by the time they come to college, it's a little late to start some of that education. But what do you do? How do you educate?
So first I would like to say that I'm so honored to be here, and this has been such an amazing almost 3 months that I've been at UH. And to begin this conversation, first we have to discuss that rape culture is a festering and hemorrhaging wound, okay? And we talk a lot about education and bits and pieces, and different kinds of education come kind of into the popular vocabulary and become words that people throw around easily. But in the end, they're all Band-Aids, and what we need is sutures and antibiotics. So we need to create a culture of consent. We need to shift a paradigm, and that's what I am trying to do here in partnership with all of the other amazing departments and resources that we have on campus. And I feel very grateful that I'm in an institution that has all of these wonderful pieces in place and that we can work with each other and play off each other. But another thing too is educating that we're talking a lot about men and women, but also non-binary people who are some of the greatest risk, and also that women can be perpetrators and that men can be victims. So raising consciousness for everybody, from victims to just every kind of student, faculty, staff, and also respondents who have been found guilty. And very often, like you're saying, it's too late. They've gotten to a point where they're being found guilty of something and they had no awareness of what they were supposed to do. So restorative justice is key in this educational piece.
And maybe you could just tell us, what are we doing now at U of H? Because I know the federal government has mandated that we have education, and I know Dr. Baker has been putting some of that, in place. So what do we have now, maybe to explain to people, so students come here, what is the education they get on this issue?
Well, I would definitely talk to Dr. Baker because he has been the founder of those initial pieces. And then with my role coming on is to continue and to branch off of that. So continuing conversations around consent, not just telling students what not to do, but what we want them to do. Explaining healthy relationships and sexual agency as some of the things that we want them to be able to see and model in sexual scripts that are healthy. So again, we're not just focusing on the negative, but we're creating a culture of positivity.
Well, that is a great segue to Dr. Baker. And I know your role, to me, is complex. You do a lot. You do education. You do investigation. So tell us a little bit about your role and what do you do and what do you see?
Sure. So I'm the Chief Compliance Officer as it relates to this particular issue. So if you could imagine, our anti-discrimination policies basically say, look, if you are treated differently because of something you cannot change about yourself, such as your race or religion, I was taught when I was yay big who God was, and I'd hate to have to change that belief just to get a job or to graduate from school or something to that effect. We look at sexual violence to be the same way. If someone is sexually assaulted on a Wednesday, what's the likelihood that they'll go to class on Thursday? Or if they're beaten by their partner? Those are weight, just like any other protected classification. And so that is in my charge, to respond to complaints of discrimination, including sexual violence. So since 2012, I'll let you know our office has done around 350 trainings on this particular topic. That training includes the very first initial interaction with the university on an official capacity, such as orientation. So for every orientation, I am there. I really dig providing education during orientation, especially at the time that they're being acclimated to the university, that we're saying this is an important topic. Now, we also, following orientation, we have a mandatory training for all new students called Salutations. For people that are looking for resources and ways to get involved, please go to uhsystem.edu/salutations. Great information. But Salutations is a training program, and the point is, hey, welcome to the University of Houston. Here are things that you need to consider while you were here, such as make sure you don't hurt your teammate, your classmate. Here's the definition of consent, sexual assault, sexual exploitation. All of those things are in our policy, which we introduce to students as soon as they get here. So for any of your new students, new graduate students, freshmen, they know about Salutation. Please ask them, what are you learning? How is this changing your conversations? Which I think this is what has happened over the past few years, especially with our massive, our campaigns, our education efforts. Reports are going up, and we're happy they're going up because people are now being more aware of the resources that they have on campus in addressing this particular issue. So from the student standpoint, they have orientation and salutations, which is both required from the standpoint of your students are getting notices that if they do not complete salutations, they cannot register for fall classes. That's a big deal. In order for you to continue, you need to take this training and pass a quiz, right? The second part is employees need to be trained as well. If you receive a report, what do? So every new employee within 30 days of employment, they have to complete orientation, which we have a presentation. Ours is the longest presentation and orientation. And then they also are required to take the mandatory training, which talks about bystander intervention, so on and so forth. So we're really active, and I'm very proud of what it is that we're doing. But with Dr. McGuire, it's going to expand and get better, and we're really excited about the direction of the university on this topic.
Well, great. When I was director of the Women's Resource Center and young women would come to campus, a lot of them would say, oh gosh, the school is scary. I'm worried about walking across campus to the library because some man with a gun or knife is going to jump out behind a bush and rape me. And so that was one of my charges, is to educate them what was a more likely scenario. So in the cases that you investigate, what kind of trends are you seeing? What kind of there's probably not a typical case, but what are some of the cases that you are seeing, if you could describe maybe one, and then how do you go about investigating that?
Sure. I would say a trend that is surprising is our high-achieving students. We have seen greater reports for those particular students, right? And it's kind of hard to figure out why exactly. They're reporting, but their classmates are usually high-achieving students as well. And so from what we've been able to gather, students that study hard, also were more likely to binge drink. And so we have found that we needed to focus our attention for those high-achieving students regarding bystander intervention, and also being aware of this particular topic in a different way. I think a lot of times we point to athletics as perpetuating a culture of rape. And I will tell you that our athletes do not receive the highest reports, not even in the top 50% of reports. The cases that people are not talking about are your engineering students and your other students, your honors students, that we have a particular concern for them. And so I think that we have to adjust our training to make sure that people don't stereotype who a perpetrator is or even who a survivor is. You know, I have reports of athletes being stalked, and that's important that we have training that addresses that particular issue for athletes just as much as respecting not just women, but your classmate, period. So that's a trend that is concerning to us.
And then how, when you get a report, let's say, to me that is surprising, I don't know for the audience, I mean, high-achieving students, but when you receive a report, how do you follow up? Can you explain to us a little bit about the investigation
Sure.
process?
So our level of sophistication has changed over the 5 years that we have done this. And so all offices that deal with this issue talk, and we talk regularly. Police department, Dean of Students Office, our office, we talk. And so when a report is delivered to our office, and many times it's through a referral from UHPD, the police department, or from the Dean of Students Office, or direct reports. A faculty person or an individual is in receipt of a report, they give us a call, and we immediately contact that person with the rights and responsibilities letters to let them know you have rights under our policy, and that right is to move forward with the complaint or not. We inform individuals involved that they can receive accommodations without pursuing a complaint. So if you want a room change, that's something that we can help facilitate, or perhaps contact a faculty member about an absence from that class, or I have concerns because my assaulter is in that class or is going to be at the rec center this evening, and I want to go. What do I do? So we work that out. We also figure out what the next steps will be for that individual, and that could be pursuing a complaint of discrimination against the assaulter or the alleged assaulter. And so we explain the process to them and help them through that particular process. Now, what's great is that our role is we're now breaking some of these things up so other offices could get involved in assisting, not only counseling, because that's something that we always offer, but our Women's Resource and Gender Center is going to be assuming a more advocacy role, so they could advocate for the survivor in a way that we haven't had in the past. We're also partnering with agencies that are off campus that have been great resources to us, but we need to give them a greater role on campus. So people have outlets outside of the university, especially if there's some distrust of the university, and I get why someone would feel that way. And so we need to make sure that we continue to have this conversation so our resources and our efficacy is increased.
Okay. Oh, well, thank you. Ms. Luther, maybe you could respond to that, because it sounds interesting that Dr. Baker is saying he's not seeing a lot of athletes. They're not in the top 50% who are some of the perpetrators. And it sounds like that's sort of different maybe from your experience and your reporting. So have you found anything within the culture of sports that seems to create an environment of more of a rape culture, or what do you see as some of those overlaps?
Sure. Well, I'm not actually surprised to hear. I mean, athletes are, statistics are so hard, right? Like, I try actually to avoid the statistics conversation because it's such an incredibly underreported crime. And then when we look at something like athletics, what we see and I don't know anything about Houston because there hasn't been anything on that, but like when I look at something like the Tennessee case that's going on right now, actively right now, we see that this program with a lot of money and a lot of clout has the ability to roll over the disciplinary process. They have the ability to elbow their way in, to get in the way of Title IX investigations. And this is the kind of thing that concerns me about athletic programs generally, is their power on campus to affect what's going on around these issues when one of their players is the one who's accused, that the university itself will bend to that, and we see that at plenty of schools. And so that's one of the particular things about sports that is different than other parts of the university. But I'm not surprised to hear that athletes don't make up the overall or the a majority or anything like that. I actually think that makes so much sense because I think we actually have a really hard time dealing with the idea that the person sitting next to us could be a perpetrator. And it's on some level, like, so few people are actually involved in athletics. And there's a distance. Like, it is really easy to be like, athletics is the problem, because most of us don't really have a relationship to it. And so you can be like, over there, there's a problem, they should fix that. When it's an engineering student who you probably sat across the table from in the library, then suddenly that's a whole other thing. I think a lot about high school. This isn't something I've written on, but I hope to. And I see so many cases. Again, I'm looking at it through sports, so I see a lot of coach stuff or hazing stuff. And I think, God, like, that's such a small community most of the time. Like, do something. And I think a lot of the time that's a lot harder for people to actually do something when it's their own community, when you could literally walk down to the high school and put your finger in someone's face, that there's something that's really intimidating about that versus, you know, saying like the coach of that big team over there in that stadium should do a thing. And so I'm not surprised at all that once people start reporting that Dr. Baker is finding those statistics.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, and that's what I found too. You know, a lot of times we think it's stranger danger, it's the boogeyman, and I blame some of these movies where we think, you know, the bad guys have to be a Hannibal Lecter, you know, kind of foaming at the mouth, when it really is the guy next door, right, who you wouldn't think is a rapist. In fact, that's one thing they always said, oh, he was the nicest guy, you know. Well, let's move on to Coach Herman. You know, we do look at the culture of masculinity, and you're right in the middle of that, being a football coach. What do you see with young men coming up? Because obviously, you know, we on the outside, we hear about, I mean, just recently, I don't know if people follow sports, but Peyton Manning was always held up as a squeaky clean guy, and now apparently we hear, and again, I love your distinction that we have to be careful about allegations or what's proven, but, you know, it has been alleged that he was in a sexual incident with a woman that was inappropriate. But do you see players coming in with a sense of entitlement? Because especially in Texas, you know, I think football is almost like a religion. So do you see players coming in with an entitlement, you know, a sexual entitlement to women, and that you have to educate that out of them, or have you seen that that's not a particular problem?
I don't think it's maybe as big a problem as we would think, and having been at all different levels of college football, from Ohio State to Houston, Iowa State, Rice, even Sam Houston State, I think over the last, I've been coaching almost 20 years, credit to everybody else up here, but the student athlete and their awareness and education coming into college is much more heightened now than probably ever has been. Could it be better? Certainly, but compared to when I started, the awareness and baseline education level is much higher. And I don't think it's a sense of entitlement. I think a lot of times, really all it takes is the mere description and or education of what is truly sexual assault, where a lot of these guys don't even know what that is, and that this action or this action or this action is A, unacceptable, and B, could get you into trouble. And I think that is where our education, once they get to us, kind of begins as to then what does this mean, and what is considered sexual assault or any kind of assault on someone. And I think that's a bit eye-opening for our student athletes. And just to kind of piggyback on what Dr. Baker and Jessica said, you know, I think the reason maybe that, you know, Jessica's written so many books and or written so many articles, there you go, one book, still a lot to me, that it exists and is reported because of notoriety and for lack of a better term, fame, where the engineering student, nobody outside of that engineering student's little pod really cares what's going on with that engineering student.
Not that we're picking on engineering.
Okay. Or
Students from
nice.
all across campus,
Yeah,
right,
yes.
right, but
There you go.
understood.
So I think that although the athletics culture or field gets a lot of publicity and it gets singled out a little bit, I think that's because of the notoriety, and that's part of playing big time Division I athletics. Is you're going to be in a microscope, and when you do something that's unacceptable, the whole world's going to know about it.
And what about the claim, and that has been, I think, on many organizations, that when something does happen, that the athletic department has such power. I mean, they bring in such money, the alumni support it, that maybe they protect a little more than transparency. And I know you've worked in all sorts of organizations. Have you seen that before? And how would you do that differently here?
No, I wish I had more experience. I really haven't. I've seen organizations, and maybe it's because of the head coaches and athletic directors that I've worked for, that it's been complete and total transparency, and really once it gets to that point, a hands-off mentality to let the proper authorities, whether it's Dr. Baker in Title IX, go through the process, whether it's a criminal process. I don't, although I do think that our young men and athletes deserve to be treated fairly, I don't think that just because you're accused, you become now a pariah, and that they should have and should be afforded every opportunity to defend themselves if they feel they have not committed anything unjust. But I haven't really seen anywhere, and maybe again that's because of the athletic directors and head coaches that I've worked for, but it really hasn't. I know I've read stories of where it is an issue, certainly, but I can't speak really firsthand on that.
And so it sounds like it's your intention here at University of Houston that you would keep hands off if such a situation would arise, or?
I was just going to say, some athletic departments have their own disciplinary process, right? So if something happens, it's handled in-house. We do not. The process that they're subjected to is the same process as any other student. To build on that, we have one policy, meaning there is no classification discrimination in our policy. If you are a faculty, staff, or student, you're exposed to the same due process as anyone else. So if there's a faculty on student report or investigation, they go through the same process as anyone else. So I just wanted to make sure that you had an accurate picture of what's happening at the University of Houston. Some other universities may have a separate process where that influence may be undue, but in terms of the University of Houston, we do not.
Okay. Well, that's very helpful to know. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, let me do one more question to Dr. McGuire, and then, as she suggested, I'm going to open it up to the audience, so be thinking of your questions next. You know, I think a common refrain is how much education needs to happen, and one thing, it just, in some ways, seems bizarre that somebody could sexually assault another person and then not know that they have. But it seems like we don't have much sex education in Texas, and we don't talk about those issues. But then sometimes you hear that these are just, miscommunications. Or then other people have done studies and said, no, it really is a more predatory behavior by a few people. So how do you see that? And then how do you educate according to how you view that these sexual assaults are happening?
So raise your hand if you were raised in consent culture. Nobody, that's right. We were all raised with these very toxic, unhealthy, imbalanced sexual scripts that we then internalize and we see played out on our campus and in our community, right? So one of the biggest challenges is helping people understand what does consent actually look like, outside of something that's written down, but in a feeling. What does it feel like? What kind of communication is going on? Is everyone's well-being and pleasure being considered in every interaction? And so having that conversation with students and then getting them to realize that rape culture has not been working for them either. Even for respondents or students who've been found guilty of sexual misconduct, when you sit down and talk to them, as I've been fortunate to be able to start to do, they're very honest with the fact that they don't understand what consent looks like, they don't understand what healthy sexual scripts feel like, but they want to. There is a desire there for that. And so I think there's a lot of hope in that. And one of the biggest things with this program in its creation is that the first thing I did when I got here was I went around to faculty and staff, and I got their feedback, and like we're hearing today from what our perspectives are on what we see going on campus. But I'm really big on lowerarchy versus hierarchy. So the next step was to focus on the students and have them help me design the program, because they will tell you the truth. They'll tell you what kind of trainings are useful, what kind of programs they have actually gleaned something from, and what hasn't worked. And so my hope is in the growth of this program over the next many years, our students are informing our program and our policy.
Wow, that sounds like a wonderful approach. I know when one thing I would like to say that I think is really helpful is, and I think Dr. Baker is responsible for putting this into our policy. In the past, when there was an instance where the next morning, let's say a young woman would say, I was raped, and it was, let's say it's a young man said, no, it was consensual. Some of the questions we would ask the victim, did you yell, did you scream, did you cry? Which is really a crazy way to ask if, something happened. I mean, like if you leave here and you have your car and you get carjacked getting into your car, you'll call the police, and when they come, hopefully they're not going to say, well, how hard did you hang on to the tailpipe as they drove away, and how hard did you resist? I mean, you're just saying, no, it was my car, someone took it without my permission. But now, across the country and at University of Houston, we do have a thing called the affirmative consent standard, where instead of asking the sexual victim, we ask the sexual initiator, what did you do to ask for consent? How did you know you had consent? So it really does shift. And I think that's so important, because when I was talking with young people, it's really interesting kind of the environment of lack of awareness, lack of sexual education. Most of them, they don't want to talk about sex. It's more intimate to talk about sex than it is to actually have sex, which is kind of a crazy thing to get your mind around. So when people don't want to talk, then that's where all the negotiation goes out the window. What are we going to use for if pregnancy prevention or sexual, is it consensual? All of these things. So there's so much work we need to do on all of these fronts. Okay, well, I'm going to stop asking questions, and I'm going to ask you all to, do we have a microphone, or how are we going to do this? Because this room, it's a little hard to hear sometimes. Do we? Yes, we do. Do we have someone willing to play Oprah who's going to hand out the microphone? Ayana, would you mind? Or okay. So if you have a question, could you raise your hand, and then right up here in the front, and then we'll go back. Lisa Robertson. Well, will they figure out? Why don't you use your loud voice, because you do. Oh. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So my question is for Dr. Baker. Since we do now have more numerous reports, are there any stats that you can share about the assaulters? Are they undergrads, graduate, domestic, international? Because I think that could be quite interesting to see what other forces, if any. And also, even if let's say someone's assaulted and they don't press charges, but you actually know that this person who's being accused has been the subject of complaints, but never prosecution. Is there a line where eventually you have to investigate, where you know this person is in fact a predator?
All right, so I will tell you most of my sexual assaults are going to be undergraduate. Most are going to be in the first 2 years. There is I think this is a common statistic. We worry about the beginning of each semester, especially at the start of the school year. So definitely want to have every message we possibly can about that particular period. And more prevention and awareness marketing at that period more than any other period in the year. My international students, I do have an interesting stat, although it's not in sexual assault, but domestic and dating violence. We have a higher trend with international students than we would have anticipated. We think that a part of that is because international students, they're less likely to report, and so we realize when we get those reports that it's been happening for some time. So that's interesting, vulnerable population as it relates to domestic and dating violence. But you asked a good question. So if you receive information and a survivor doesn't want to move forward with the complaint, what do? Well, a part of our policy basically says that the university has the ability to move forward as complainant, meaning if I'm able to collect information without the survivor providing it or having to move forward with the complaint, then I have an obligation to weigh that information to see if I can show that there's a violation of the policy or not. I'll give you an example. So a survivor may say, no, I don't want to move forward, yet someone else provides a video of an assault or something occurring. What do I do with that video? Well, I move forward with the complaint, and we have done that many times. We have expelled students without the survivor having to participate in the process. It's sometimes very difficult to do, but that's our obligation. If we have enough information independent of what the survivor has provided us, then we move forward under our policy with the complainant being the university.
I think, question here, would you mind coming up? Oh, okay. Oh, great.
Great. Okay. First, I want to say that my husband is a huge, huge Cougar fan, and he is going to be so excited that I got to be in this room with you and hear you speak. So my question is, what happens while you're educating either an individual or a group when the people involved come from homes where sexism or sexual domestic violence is a norm? Well, anybody can answer,
Yeah,
but certainly.
It's hard. It certainly makes education much more difficult because, as with anything, if you grow up around it, it becomes the norm. And, we deal with it, I know, different topic, but we deal with it with marijuana use quite a bit. That, they grow up in homes where it's just okay that we use marijuana. Well, you're not going to use marijuana when you're part of this football team, and so that part requires quite a bit of training, and I think that's why it's so important to dive into these young men's lives and to know everything about them, even in the recruiting process, is to find out what kind of background are they coming from and where are some hot topics maybe that you're going to need to address with each individual. And I think that's where, again, where I said the education, you've got to A, bombard them with it, but B, it has to be localized as well to where you're diving into specific issues with a young man and his life. And I would beg to differ with Dr. McGuire. I did grow up in a culture of consent. I'm the only child of a single mom. So needless to say, my mom, there was a definite culture of treating women right in my house. But I do know that that's not the norm either. And that, or I shouldn't say that, not the norm, but that doesn't always happen. And we have to treat each player, each individual as individuals and find out what their issues are.
Go ahead.
So I think it's awesome that, and I think many of us grew up in households of consent, but a culture of consent means your entire community was on board, and I can't think of many communities. There are some tribes in Southeast Asia, for example, the Krung, who are very culture of consent focused, but it is extremely rare. Also, so talking about educating people when they're coming from a background that's difficult, that's one of the key things that we talk about in my trainings is where do we get our ideas about relationships and scripting and everything from your primary caregivers in the first 5 years of your life, is how you relate what love is and what communication is. So awakening students and people to what they've been fed and what's been ingrained in their mind, and then helping them see those patterns so that they can then mindfully choose to change them. Another really important part of this, which Dr. Baker touched on a little bit with the international students, International Student Office was the first office I went to when I got here, because cultural competency in these conversations is vital. Relationships, sexuality, scripting looks completely different around the world, and across generations, and across genders, and across orientations. So we have to be mindful of that. There isn't one line that we can feed to everybody that will make sense to them, and we have to be respectful of the differences in different communities and work with them, not against them.
Dr. Baker, did you have? Okay, how about right here? And then we'll go to this young man, and then we'll come over here. Okay.
Yes, this is just to follow up on the important theme I think that's been introduced with respect to the socialization and the experiences that have preceded one coming to the university. So I wonder if you see any hopeful trends with respect to this messages getting planted and nurtured earlier through teaching, through social services, through criminal justice, and secondarily, what is the university doing with respect to incorporating these ideas in curriculum that are training professionals to go out and work in these areas, in schools, in social service, in athletics, in high school, and would appreciate the commentary on that.
That's a big, complex question. How about panelists? Dr. Baker, you want to start?
Okay. Well, number one, I talked about partnerships, and I think an important partnership we have is with Fort Bend's Women's Center, in that they currently deliver K-12 education on this topic. They receive grant funding on this topic, and we want to extend salutations to the K-12 pipeline that we know is going to wind up at the University of Houston. If they don't, great, they can take this information with them wherever they go. But we do want to have this conversation before they get to campus, understanding that getting the yes before you get the no, that's so critical and so important. A concept that we can't wait until they get here if we can go younger. And that's one of the things that we're doing. In terms of incorporating it in the curriculum, I think that we're working with faculty and figuring out what will work. We have thought about, we need to include this information in syllabus. In the syllabi. We want people to know not only where to report, but also what resources are available to them in the first document they get in a class. So we're talking about ways that we can incorporate this into the curriculum, and I think with time, it will be something that we do presentations in classes, but it would be great if the conversation is extended beyond orientation or the mandatory training that people have to take, where it almost seems like it's punitive. This issue will change. How do we end sexual assault? I mean, it's such a complex question, but it has to include students. It has to include students talking about this, talking about it with their peers, talking about healthy relationships, talking about consent. It has to include them. And so if we have these messages in all kinds of areas, including the classroom and in the dorm room and in text messages and social media, I think those messages will create change.
I know, just to add on to that, I would do, when I was director of the Women's Resource Center, I would go into the fraternities and do a program about consent. And one trend that I found really helpful is that the young men were hungry for it. You know, I thought they would be a little resistant, but they grew up in a culture where they're heavily involved in pornography, and a lot of pornography, you know, is very objectifies women, misogynistic, you know, violence-based, and all the movies and the video games. And so much of their culture gives them this one message. And, you know, obviously parents a lot of times are uncomfortable talking about sexual issues. So to me, they were hungry for information. And most of them, I think they wanted to be good men and good guys. And so I think we just need to start having those age-appropriate conversations, you know, much earlier. But I see some hopeful signs that the culture is shifting. This young man over here. Oh, yes, go ahead.
And I just want to also say, as far as what we're seeing as the progress around the country and on this issue is, for example, like California has a law now that students have to receive comprehensive sex ed. 2 students sued the state recently because they didn't feel their sex ed was perfect enough, and they won. So that's really exciting because consent is in those conversations. And like you're saying, it starts with how we talk to our children. Do we make sure our children, don't have to give grandma a kiss if they don't feel comfortable? That's teaching them agency and consent. It starts very, very young and goes throughout the lifespan. And I think another important thing that we do have to include in this conversation is not to have benevolent sexism. So we want to make sure where we're saying, like, we're talking a lot about men and women and like being kind to women, but we want to make sure it's not, in a sexist way that is subversive and maybe not as clear. So I think that's a very important part of this.
Go ahead.
How do we make this topic comfortable for students to want to come out and learn about? And also for the orientation trainings, does it just happen once and they never have to do this again?
They only have to go through orientation once, but if they come back as a graduate student, then they will go through it again. And it's mandatory that for every orientation class that you have a section on sexual misconduct, right? To make this comfortable for students, that's tough. And I say that from the standpoint of I'm looking at it from a multitude of lenses. I think activism, a variety of contexts is taking place at a level across America that this is an exciting time for students on a variety of issues. I think there are movements where students are saying, I've had enough, institution do more, but I think each campus and each university is different because they have their own history and their own issues, and so I think the reflection of the activism is on that from an institutional historical context. University of Houston, I haven't seen the level of activism as much. So having this conversation has been tough, and I'm not saying that it's at the fault of students. I don't think so, but I think there are students that have taken this issue on, some great student organizations that are talking about this issue, but I haven't seen students own this issue. And as a Title IX coordinator, I do want students to take greater ownership of moving our sexual assault and awareness campaigns and making it theirs. So the language, the movement is theirs. And it's also something that they're holding their peers accountable for having attitudes that don't reflect where we're going. It's something for me to go in and have a conversation about sex and students say, for the 40-year-old man, you did pretty good. But that's, but what about the 18 to 22-year-old? Holding accountable another 18 to 22-year-old about their attitudes on this particular epidemic, because it is what it is, right? So, I think students they will feel more comfortable in embracing the idea that we can change the culture of this particular community. The more interest they have, and realizing that their voice is a very important voice. People listen, administrators listen. Chancellor has sat down. We've talked to students about their experiences. What can we do? So they need to realize they have that power.
I think being a part of a healthy group, like Dr. Baker was saying, helps. It helps generate conversation. It helps generate accountability. I know, and maybe Jessica can speak on, I think sometimes a team of 120 football players kind of seen as a mob mentality, but when the group is actually educated and well-versed in accountability, that it can be very positive to be part of that group, because that group then, the members of that group kind of dictate what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I know for our team, it's very clear what's acceptable and unacceptable within our family unit. And I think it's important too that I would imagine, Dr. Baker, I don't have the stats, but that most of these cases happen when someone is under the influence too. And are we going to stop drinking on college campuses? No, but I think if you have an accountability kind of partner, kind of buddy that can pull you out of bad situations, I think that's a big key. And I know, but some groups can turn the other way if the culture in that group is not healthy.
Well, and you brought up a good question, I think, when you're asking about, is that enough? The research, and we are a Research One University, so we have to cite a little research up here, is that a single dose isn't enough. So one single orientation, no, is not enough. And you're hearing so much at orientation, how much do you retain? So you have to hear it multiple times in multiple ways. So I think that's what Dr. Baker's very interested in is,
Yeah.
Moving beyond that. So if, individual student organizations, or they hear it in their class, or they hear it other places, they hear it from other peers. So you're right, it has to be multiple.
I think multiple is key. We have sent out a number of, I don't know if that's me, is that me? All right. A number of notifications in the past month, maybe 3 notifications, not only about coups, get consent, salutations, but also our non-discrimination statement, a Circle of Six app, an app that, okay, great, you know about Circle of Six? Awesome. Help create it? Okay, great. See, endorsement, kind of. So we have, but again, I don't know if that dose, of course it's not enough, but is it legit? Yes, it's legitimate that we have a process. But to change attitudes, I think it's going to take a peer. The person that you're listening to for all kinds of advice, to say we don't do that. We don't take advantage of someone. We don't slip people drugs in order to sleep with them. We don't beat on our partners, etc. I think we need doses from peers as well, and hopefully we'll get more of that as we create safe environments for people to talk about.
I wanted to add that one of the things that we talk a lot about and we hear a lot about is bystander intervention, and it's a useful idea. We always have to talk about who feels like they can't intervene and why, because there's always sort of power structures involved in that. We talk about it with maybe team culture and like whether or not you can go against your teammate if you have to go into the locker room the next day and be on a team with them. There's that kind of power structure. But one of the things is that there's a spectrum here, right? And on one end is this kind of sexual violence, and on the other is maybe benevolent sexism, right? Or just sexism, sort of basic everyday things that happen. Like one of the things I think about when I think about sports culture is whether or not, can I say a bad word?
Yes, you may. Go right ahead.
Whether or not in the locker room, men are calling each other pussies, right? Whether or not they're using gendered language that makes women as inferior to men as part of the way that they talk to each other, the way that they pump each other up, the way they talk about the other team, the sort of the competitive nature, the thing that is the seed or the root that one day when they have a personal interaction with a woman, those ideas that are fostered in this other environment come into play with whether or not they're going to listen to them, read the signals, like whether or not they're going to care about their consent, right? That's the spectrum. Bystander intervention should also be thought of as a spectrum, and we fail, I think, a lot of the time to talk about it that way. So most of us imagine as bystander intervention is the moment when you think something bad is about to happen. And ideally we could all intervene, but that's just not always true. People are confused, they don't know what's happening, they might be impaired themselves, they might have some kind of power dynamic with the person they think is about to perpetrate the crime. But on the spectrum of things, it's when your friend makes a joke and they call someone a pussy. And you say, why is that funny to you? What's the joke there, right? Like there's a whole spectrum of moments when we can intervene in the culture and stop it and make people aware of the sort of the root things that they're doing all the time, the way they think about other people. And I feel like bystander intervention is so boiled down and flattened in our conversation. We want that to be the answer. We want it to be that we can always intervene right before something bad happens, which of course is not true. And we just always need a bigger conversation about how we can all sort of affect the larger culture.
And then lastly, what are we doing on campus to make this an ongoing conversation is they created this program in this position, which is so exciting because a lot of different offices have done incredible work on this issue on this campus and all the UH campuses, but we needed somewhere where it was centralized with experts, et cetera, and then we can work together and make sure that it's not something that's once touched on or just a panel, but something that's everyday, constant conversation, events, trainings, et cetera. It's very exciting.
And this young woman, and then we'll head back into this crowd. So yes, Ayana.
Okay. In America, or in society in general, it's still difficult to be trans, queer, or LGBTQIA. And I wanted to know, specifically towards Dr. McGuire, and I think Dr. Baker can also answer this question, but what do you have in terms of access and resources, in terms of sexual health and issues and practices for those individuals?
Yes. Well, so we have the LGBTQ Resource Center, which you probably are aware of. I'm a sexologist. My dissertation included inclusion of LGBT plus people. That's a huge passion of mine. I think one of the things when talking about sexual assault and resources is we have to stop just saying men's centers, women's centers, and creating everything on a binary, and then forcing people to identify with something that they don't feel comfortable with. And then also our inclusion of our language. Again, not gendering it, not having little microaggressions sprinkled in there, not having also not only misogyny but misandry, which often comes up in these conversations. So I think the first step is awareness. The second step is infusion into our curriculum with those topics, and then making sure that we find community resources as well as campus resources that are open to addressing those issues in a really queer, competent manner.
In terms of resources, if you go to Salutations, we have resources specifically for everyone, right? But we have a section on LGBT resources. We have I'm happy that we have a gender-neutral policy. And lastly, sexual orientation, gender expression, and identity is a protected classification at the University of Houston. So in terms of compliance, even though the law hasn't gotten there yet, we're there, and I'm proud of that.
And I'm glad you raised that point because the latest study, the AAUW study that they did, 10,000 people were involved in, I mean, the highest concentration of victims were within that population. And you're right, sometimes we do get stuck in men perpetrators, women victims, and we don't talk about trans folks or non-gender binary people. So thanks for raising that question. Okay, the young woman in the red sweater back there.
Good afternoon. My question, I have two. One is for Dr. Baker. I know you just spoke briefly on resources, but I wanted to know, we've had a couple of survivors come to our agency who are U of H students. Do you guys have anyone on campus that provides legal advocacy, assists with like crime victims compensation, or are those resources that you refer out? And then my question for Dr. McGuire is as far as some of the education that you guys are doing in the community. Part of what we do at our agency is out in the middle schools and the schools, and I was wondering, are parents also getting some type of flyer or some type of information, I'm assuming for their freshmen? I know when they come to college they're adults, but I didn't know if any of the parents were also getting resources on consent and healthy relationships. So those are my questions.
Great questions, yeah.
Guess I go first. Okay, so in terms of crime victim resources, we have done that in our office. We've done that. We are not doing that now because we are to investigate. We don't want to take on an advocacy role. However, that role has been transferred to our Women's Resource and Gender Center. Right, so where we'll have advocates or advocacy taking place there. But that doesn't mean that we won't partner with any other agencies. In fact, we need to figure out how we're going to do that. And we have talked to some agencies about how we'll facilitate that. It'll probably be an MOU with the group of agencies, but we do need to start working together. I don't think that we have partnered in a way that is most effective. So I mean, that's a part of it. I think the second question was about parents. So, and I can briefly state that for many, we have a huge transfer population, and for whatever reason, I don't know why we do this, but we require parents to come to the transfer students' orientation, and so we actually present with parents in the room. We have a conversation about sexual assault and consent with parents in the room. So from that standpoint, yes. In the future, what you'll see, and this isn't because UH is taking the lead on this, but it's something that OCR is strongly recommending, is that in all of our materials, whether it be any promotion materials about the university. So when you get something that says, hey, we want you to come to the university, it will have a statement, our non-discrimination statement that basically says, sexual assault is so on and so forth, a violation of our policy. Here's where you report discrimination, and the Title IX coordinator is Rich Baker, so on and so forth. So they'll have that information in any promotional material. Last thing, at the bottom of every web page at the University of Houston, there is a sexual misconduct Title IX link. So as you get information about, what courses you want to take or whatever, there will be a button that you would that you can press to take you to our area. So that's a part of the initial conversation with parents that we're having now.
Can I call you did use a couple alphabets that people might not be familiar with, so
I did.
MOU and OCR.
What did I say?
MOU and OCR.
Memorandum of Understanding. So we currently have an MOU for on-campus, and you helped us create that and the off-campus one with Harris County. But we want to expand that with other agencies and have a formal agreement about what services they're going to be providing. Maybe even providing office space on campus. We just want people to feel comfortable. And so that conversation in that memorandum is a part of our strategic effort to end sexual assault on campus. The second thing is the Office of Civil Rights, which is a part of the Department of Education. They are the enforcers of Title IX. And so they provide guidance on this particular area, on what we should be doing on campus. And one of the things is to include a non-discrimination statement in every bit of promotional material with the university. And so you've received that in your email the last couple of months, but you will see that in every brochure as well.
You asked about resources in the community. What agency are you from? The Bridge. Awesome. Yes. Well, so one of the things that I've been doing for the past 3 months is making sure I get in connection with as many agencies as I can, which includes yours. Have met with some of your people, including even like reaching out into our community for trauma-informed services for forensic nursing, for example, including education. And then with parents, I think that's extremely important. Like Dr. Baker saying, they have already planted that seed, but I think expanding it is vital because we want them to also go home to households and communities that are on the same page.
I have to say, Thesha Jenkins is in our salutations train. Did you know that?
Great.
Okay.
We have time for a couple more questions. Oh, Dr. Gregory.
It does seem to me that several of you have said things that sounded like we should have a required WGSS Intro to Women's and Gender Studies at the university so that we can address a lot of the kind of questions that people were raising in a more consistent way. And that's something that, we look around and we think, even at the university, most people don't go to the university, and really we do need, as you were suggesting, many more courses that give people agency around issues of gender in high school, just so that they'll not only come here with those ideas, but so that when they go wherever they are going, that's part of the discussion. And that really has not been part of the discussion in Texas. It might be great in California, but that sort of been the opposite in terms of the rules here. And I know that at Rice they recently instituted a requirement that all students take a sex ed course, just because they weren't coming with information that was vital to their being, as social beings. But my other question was about a different rule, which is the upcoming campus carry dynamic. And just wondering how people think that will impact gender dynamics on campus in terms of sexual assault if some people have weapons, and is that going to be a good thing? Could be the people, either party, and well, I guess that's basically it. Is it a Title IX violation?
Can I touch on the first part? Yes, you're right. We should require, there's many things that go into a degree plan, in my opinion, that don't serve us very well. I know in my master's program, I took an undergrad class at the University of Texas called Personal and Family Finance, and it taught me how to balance my checkbook and taught me about car insurance and rent and versus buying and all that stuff. So there's so many things on a college campus that we take to educate us that really may not assist us in our daily lives, and I think that's one of them is sexual education and/or some kind of education on that topic. And I will say, we were talking about educating before college, and I don't know if it's a requirement in the state of Texas, but I do know, because of the work of Jessica and many others that have brought kind of the athletic culture under the microscope, I know every one of our high school kids that we recruit has had some form of education as being part of a high school football team. And so again, I don't know if that's mandated by the UIL, if it's just something that every coach feels necessary to do to educate his kids and players nowadays. But again, to me, that goes along with, get involved in groups. I think we have to encourage our young people to, whether it's any kind of group, a hobby group, a sports group, a theater group, it doesn't matter, but then that group, again, you talked about bystander intervention. I think, again, I use the phrase, pull a guy away from a bad situation, but I think what gets lost in there too is what's acceptable. When I said everybody on our team knows what's acceptable and what's not acceptable because of the culture that's created within that. And so bystander intervention goes all the way to initiation, if that's if you want to use that word, to when they first step in that kind of environment. I think it's very well documented what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. But I do think that we need more classes, more mandated classes in college for a lot of different things too.
Okay, and what about the second part of the question? We have
Coach Herman, did you want to take the second part of that question?
we have sex, we have alcohol, and now we got guns on campus.
Yeah.
What is that going to mean for this issue?
So I will tell you, in terms of weapons used in a sexual assault, I do not have many of those reports. But I'm not naive to think that we won't have, campus carry will not have some sort of impact. I can see something happening where I was aware of the pistol in the closet, and so I was concerned, and I can see that. And I can see that being something that I would consider when I investigate cases of sexual assault. So I see that being something that I let people know, that I state during a training, because I need to inform respondents. I need to make them aware of these issues, especially if that's something I'm going to consider. But do I know what the impact is going to be of campus carry? I do not. But I did want to say this, although you didn't ask this particular question. We are doing a survey, a sexual misconduct and attitude survey. Many universities have already done that, and hopefully we'll gather more information and what people have asked about what our students are thinking and how safe they feel on campus and what they think in terms of resources. I don't know if we've asked a question about campus carry, and I don't know if they would have impact per se, but it makes sense. That's a new issue that we do need to hear from students about, and so I can see that being a possible survey question. The other part where you wanted to know trends and things that we are concerned about, and one of that is non-affiliated individuals, people that are not a part of the University of Houston, however, are respondents in sexual assault cases. And so I think a part of our efforts in having the safest campus we possibly can is to take this conversation outside of the University of Houston and also in the community, because we do get those reports. Although there's very little that we can do for people that are non-affiliated, they still are subject to our policy. If they don't participate, they may never be able to step foot on campus. Plus, we are working with the police departments to prosecute. But that's, you wanting to know trends, that's another trend that's of an issue. But whether or not campus carry is going to have a great impact on what we do, I know it's going to be a part of our education, but I can't anticipate what kind of impact it actually will have.
I'd just like to say that there was a report sometime in the last year, I wrote about this somewhere, the Texas Observer, about sexual assault in Texas generally, just the general population. And in that finding, I think it was very low, like 10% of reported sexual assaults involved a weapon, which is one of the sort of myths of sexual assault, right? That like, I mean, the kind of threat that's involved, the way that the violence plays out is not necessarily tied to weaponry. And so I don't know what that will mean, you know, on campuses with guns, but what we see in Texas overall, which is a pretty gun-happy place, is that it actually doesn't play a role most of the time. And the other,
Go ahead.
oh, sorry. The other thing I wanted to add is that, and I'm not going to get any of this totally correct, that the legislature is actually taking up the issue of campus sexual assault very soon on March 8th or 9th. There's going to be a committee hearing about this. I think it's Donna Howard's, I know Donna Howard's office is involved in this. I'm not totally sure. It's really hard to tell from like the many descriptions that they put online exactly what they're going to be talking about around this issue. But the legislature, with everything that's come out, especially I think Baylor is probably the big push there. They are now in the legislature at least talking about this in some form. So, you know, who knows what to make of the Texas legislature taking up anything, but they are aware.
Well, our time has come to an end. That hour and a half flew by so fast. Well, I want to thank you all for being here, but I especially want to thank our panelists. Thank you all so much. You were great.